I was 7 the night I decided to walk into a Mafia boss's restaurant and tell him to look under his car. I didn't have those words for it back then, of course. Back then, it was just a hot September night in the old part of Savannah. The kind where the air feels thick enough to drink, and the streetlights smear halos on the bricks. I remember my back pressed against the rough wall behind my mom's flower shop, my palms sweaty on the straps of my backpack, and my heart beating so hard I was convinced the whole block could hear it. Across the narrow street, the Moretti's sign glowed over the corner restaurant, warm and golden, like something out of a different world. Inside, there were linen tablecloths and candlelight and clinking glasses. Outside, in the shadows where I was, there were dumpsters and oil stains and a little girl trying to decide whether to ruin a cop's big moment or keep her mouth shut and pretend she hadn't seen anything. When you grow up in a neighborhood like mine, you learn names before you learn spelling. The Morettis were one of those names. People said it quietly, with a little tilt of the head, the way they talked about hurricanes or bad diagnoses. Some folks called them a family of businessmen, some called them criminals, and most called them something in between when they thought kids weren't listening. I listened anyway. I heard the stories about how they ran the docks, how nothing went in or out of the port without them knowing. I heard about the suits and the cars and the money. I also heard about the time they paid for Mrs. Hernandez's surgery when her insurance refused, and how the lights at the community center somehow stayed on all winter, even when everyone knew the bills were overdue. Adults like to pretend those two things couldn't belong to the same people. Kids know better. We're used to things being messy. I had my own reason to feel twisted up about them. The winter before that night, someone had smashed the windows of my mother's flower shop. They left the glass everywhere, crushed stems and muddy footprints, and words sprayed in red paint that I didn't fully understand but knew were ugly. My mom called the police. The police took notes, looked tired, and left. Nobody came back. But that same night, long after my mom cried herself to sleep on the couch, I woke up to the sound of trucks outside. I remember peeking through the blinds with my feet numb from the cold and watching a crew of men with work lights and quiet voices board up the windows, scrub paint from the bricks, and sweep up the glass. They worked fast and clean. By sunrise, the shop looked like nothing had happened. On the counter, they left an envelope with no logo, no explanation, just a short card and enough cash to replace everything. The handwriting on the card said that nobody deserved to be told they did not belong in their own neighborhood. My mom never said the name Moretti out loud in connection with that night, but she hid the card in the same place she hid important papers. And she warned me twice as hard afterward to stay away from those men, because help can come with its own price tag. So, standing in that alley at 7 years old, staring at the back door of Moretti's across from the shop, I was carrying all of that in my small body. Fear, gratitude, suspicion, and that stubborn little streak that had gotten me in trouble at school, more than once for speaking up when adults wanted silence. That afternoon, when the sun was still up and the street was busy, I had been taking trash out to the alley behind the flower shop. I remember the smell of old water and cardboard, the buzz of an air conditioner unit, the way my sneakers slipped a little on something slick. That was when I saw them. Detective Ethan Cole was hard to miss, even to a kid. He had the kind of face that made the news anchors smile a little brighter, the kind they put on posters about cleaning up the city. I'd seen him on television, standing next to the mayor, shaking hands, talking about keeping families safe. In person, he looked exactly the same, except his eyes were harder. He and another man in plain clothes were crouched by the black sedan Dominic Moretti always used, parked just behind the restaurant where our alley emptied out. They didn't see me. I was small and used to being invisible. I remember the glint of something plastic wrapped in Ethan's hands, the careful way he reached up under the car, the quick, efficient movements like he'd done this many times before. I couldn't make out every word, but some phrases landed sharp enough to stick. Trash that needs to be taken out. Cancer in the city. About time somebody cleaned this block up for good. They were phrases I had heard in other mouths, pointed at people who looked like my neighbors, people who sounded like my mom, people who didn't have lawyers or perfect English. I didn't understand the details, but I knew this. Whatever they were doing under that car, they weren't supposed to be doing it in secret. And whatever they were planning, it wasn't justice. I slipped backward before they could turn and see me, heart hammering, fingers numb. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of schoolwork and helping my mom with bouquets, but my mind stayed stuck on those plastic-wrapped packages and that ugly satisfaction in Ethan Cole's voice. By the time night fell and the dinner rush started at Moretti's, the street felt different. The usual traffic thinned. A couple of unmarked cars cruised by slower than they needed to, windows tinted. engines too quiet for my liking. I watched them from the doorway of the shop, then from the alley, my feet moving without permission. I knew Dominic was inside. I had seen him a few times from a distance over the years. Tall, dark suit. That particular way of walking like the sidewalk was his, and the city was just borrowing it. To me, at 7, he wasn't a man so much as a story made flesh, the center of all the warnings and half-whispers. People said he was dangerous. People said he was generous. People said he was poison. People never agreed, but they all agreed on one thing. You did not get in his way. So there I was, 7 years old, pressed against rough brick in the humid dark, watching cars I knew were police circle the block like patient sharks. I could practically hear the way the news would frame it, could almost imagine Ethan Cole on television again, this time with evidence in his hands and trophies in his eyes. There is a moment, right before you do something that will change your life, when you wish very badly to be the kind of person who can look away. I remember that moment clearly. I remember telling myself that I was just a kid, that adults knew better, that my mom needed me, that people like Dominic Moretti chose their own risks and didn't need saving from little girls. I also remember the picture that kept pushing through all those excuses. 3 plastic-wrapped bricks under a car that did not belong to Ethan Cole, and the memory of an envelope on my mother's counter that had arrived when no one else came. It took me a long time to understand that I wasn't choosing between good guys and bad guys that night. I was choosing between silence and what my gut refused to let go of. Looking back now, with all the years and consequences between that alley and the woman I am, I can say this plainly. I saw Detective Ethan Cole, the hero of Savannah, planting evidence under Dominic Moretti's car. At 7 years old, I did not have that language. What I had was a knot in my stomach, a burning in my chest, and the sense that if I didn't speak, something terrible was about to happen in front of my mother's shop. So I pushed my back off the wall. I stepped out of the shadows, and I turned toward the warm light spilling from Moretti's front door, knowing that the next few minutes would either save a man the whole city feared, or destroy a life I hadn't even really started yet. I remember the sound of my own footsteps first. They were too loud in my ears as I crossed that little strip of asphalt between the alley and the restaurant. Every step felt like it should echo, like someone would look out and shout at me to go home, to mind my business, to stop pretending I mattered in a story like this. No one did. The street was strangely quiet, just the hum of engines idling somewhere out of sight, the faint hiss of a fryer venting from the kitchen, and my sneakers on the cracked pavement. The door to Moretti's was heavier than I expected. I had to lean my whole body weight into it, fingers slipping on the brass handle, my backpack sliding down my shoulder. For a second, I thought it would not budge, and that would be my excuse, the universe telling me I had tried. Then it gave way all at once, and warm light and noise spilled over me. Walking into that room felt like stepping onto another planet. Outside, the air had smelled like oil and wet cardboard. Inside, it smelled like garlic and roasted tomatoes and expensive wine, like polished wood and old money. There were candles on every table, flames wavering in the air conditioning, throwing little shadows that made the silverware glitter. People laughed in low voices, leaning close across white tablecloths. It was the kind of place I had only ever seen when I pressed my face to the glass as we walked past at night. All of that stopped when I came in. You do not realize how loud a restaurant is until it goes quiet. Conversations did not cut off all at once. They died in layers. A nearby table noticed me, then another, and then some invisible line was crossed where the whole room understood something unusual was happening. Forks hovered midway between plates and mouths. A server with a tray slowed down and shuffled to the side. I felt every eye drag over me, cataloging the messy braids coming loose from their elastics, the scuffed shoes, the cheap backpack hugged tight to my chest. In their world, kids my age appeared in family photos, not at the front door alone after dark. I did not know the words for shame and defiance back then, but I felt both at once. Part of me burned with the sense that I was out of place, that I was breaking a rule everyone else had been born knowing. Another part of me thought about those plastic-wrapped packages under the car and wanted to shove past these people with their wine glasses and pretty clothes, and yell at them that something bad was coming if someone did not listen to me. A man in a black suit with a white towel over his arm started toward me, the kind of person who tells you politely that you do not belong. I remember his eyebrows pinching together, his mouth tightening like he was about to ask where my parents were. He got a few steps in my direction and then stopped. His eyes flicked past me, toward the back corner of the room. I followed his gaze and saw Dominic Moretti properly for the first time. He was seated at a corner table that seemed like it had been built around him. There were 4 other men there, all in dark suits, but my eyes went to him and stayed there. He wore a charcoal jacket that fit like it had been made only for him, a crisp white shirt, and a dark tie. His hair was darker then, with just a touch of silver at the temples, combed back smoothly. His hands rested on the table, broad and still, fingers curved around the stem of a wine glass he was not lifting. It was not his clothes or his face that made the room feel different. It was the way the space arranged itself around him. Conversations angled away, glances slid off him quickly, like staring too long might be dangerous. Even from the door, I could feel the gravity he carried, the sort that did not need to raise its voice to be obeyed. And yet, when his eyes met mine across that distance, what I remember most is not the danger. I remember the attention. It felt like being pinned by a searchlight. Not unkind, not kind either, just absolute. He said something then. I do not know his exact words anymore, but I remember the way he lifted his chin slightly, the way his hand moved just enough to stop the man in the black suit from coming closer. Later, I would learn that it was he giving permission, telling his people to let things play out. At 7, all I understood was that the man with the towel stepped back, and no one physically blocked my path. That left me with no excuse. The distance from the door to that corner table could not have been more than a handful of strides. To me, it felt like crossing a football field. My legs felt heavy, like they belonged to someone else. My heart pounded in my throat. I could hear chairs creak as people turned to watch me pass. The clink of cutlery started up again in little bursts and then faltered whenever I came too close, like the room was holding its breath in pockets. I kept my eyes mostly on the floor at first, the dark wood, the patterns of the rugs, the polished shoes of men who could afford to eat here, but I could not avoid lifting my gaze when I reached his table. From up close, Dominic looked both more ordinary and more unsettling. The lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper than I expected. There was a faint scar near his eyebrow, just a pale line against his skin. Details like that made him human, and for some reason, that made him scarier. Monsters in stories are one thing. Real men with tired eyes and old scars are another. He studied me for a long second, and I felt my throat go dry. My rehearsed explanations scattered. What came out instead was the shaky truth, as my 7-year-old brain could organize it. That I was Lena from the flower shop across the street, that I had seen something bad in the alley behind his car earlier that day, that police officers had been where they should not be, doing things they should not have done. I did not list evidence, codes, or model numbers. I talked about the way they had hidden their movements, the way their voices sounded when they talked about cleaning up trash. I mentioned the plastic around the packages, and the blinking light I thought might be a tracker because I had seen the same kind of blinkers on delivery vans. I remember feeling like every word might be the one that made him wave me away. The strange thing is, he did not. He did not laugh or tell me I was imagining things. He did not look bored. He listened, really listened, with the same intensity he had when he first looked at me from across the room. He asked a few short questions, things like when, where, who, but in my memory, they are more like impressions than sentences. His interest sharpening at the mention of Detective Ethan Cole, the subtle tightening around his mouth when I described the alley behind our shop. Outside the restaurant's front windows, the world was shifting. Even as I tried to get the words out, I could see motion in the glass behind him. Headlights sliding into place along the curb, dark shapes moving with purpose. The glint of badges catches the lamplight. The energy in the room felt like the air right before a storm, charged and expectant. I think he sensed it too. There was a moment where he glanced past me, toward the entrance, then back at my face. Whatever calculation he made in that heartbeat changed the rest of our lives. If he had chosen to keep me there and handle it quietly, the story might have ended with handcuffs and headlines about a brave detective and his big bust. Instead, he decided on something else. He pushed his chair back slowly, the sound of it scraping across the floor startling in the quiet. His men stirred, hands hovering near jackets, eyes tracking his every move. What he did then, in essence, was claim me. He rose and moved so that he stood not behind the table but beside me, like we were somehow on the same side of whatever this was. He told the room, in that calm, low voice that carried even when he did not raise it, that they would all be going outside together. Him, his men, the child from the flower shop had just brought them very important information. I only understood the words later. At the moment, what I felt was his presence at my shoulder as we turned toward the door together. Half the restaurant rose with us, some out of obligation, some out of curiosity. Phones appeared in people's hands, slow and furtive. I caught a glimpse of my own reflection in the glass as we approached the entrance. Wide eyes, flushed cheeks, a man in a perfect suit towering behind me. When the door opened again, the night felt heavier. There were more cars now, lined up like a row of dark teeth along the curb. Men in suits and tactical vests stood near them, trying to look casual and failing. At the center of it all, framed by the gaslight, was Detective Ethan Cole. I had seen him on television. I had seen him in my alley. And now I saw him here, in the moment he thought he was about to make history. His shoulders were squared, his jaw set just so. His expression arranged in that blend of concern and determination the news cameras love. He looked past Dominic first, like he was rehearsing a speech in his head. Then his gaze dropped and found me, standing half a step in front of the man he had planned to take down. The crack was tiny, a hitch in his breath, a flicker in his eyes where confidence gave way to something raw. For the briefest second, the mask slipped, and I saw it there. Recognition and fear. The awful knowledge that the little girl from the alley had not stayed where he left her. I did not know what would happen next. I just knew that we were all walking out into a night that would not let any of us go back to who we had been when the evening started. From the doorway, the sidewalk looked like a stage somebody had set up without telling me. There was a row of cars first, gleaming under the streetlights like a line of dark animals at rest. Dominic's black sedan, another black one behind it, a deep blue car, a silver one, all of them clean, expensive, parked nose to tail along the curb. Beyond them, the building fronts glowed with gas lamps and neon signs, the old brick and iron balconies of the historic district watching from above like silent witnesses. Then there were the people, cops in plain suits and tactical vests, trying to look relaxed and landing somewhere closer to coiled. Restaurant staff are hovering in the doorway behind us, diners drifting out with their phones half raised, pretending to check messages while angling their cameras. Neighbors from the next block over, drawn by the sirens and the sight of 3 unmarked cars that did not belong on a quiet evening like this. And there was I, a 7-year-old in a wrinkled school jumper, standing at Dominic Moretti's elbow like I had any right to be part of this. I remember the feel of the night air on my face, cooler than the restaurant but thick with exhaust and heat from the parked engines. I remember the way the streetlights threw long shadows, stretching Dominic and the officers into taller, distorted versions of themselves. Everything felt too bright and too dark at the same time. Ethan Cole tried to take control immediately. He had that practiced posture, feet set just so, hand close to his belt as if he were ready for anything. His voice came out steady and official, the way it did in the clips I had seen on television. He talked about warrants, credible intelligence, and ongoing investigations. He said people needed to stay inside while the police did their job. I did not catch every phrase, but that was the gist of it. Power, procedure, authority. What I remember most is that Dominic did not back up a step. He listened, head slightly tilted, eyes steady. When Ethan finished his little speech, Dominic simply stated that there had been a development. He said he preferred that whatever was about to happen take place where everyone could see it. He gestured to the people with phones and the neighbors gathering near the edge of the sidewalk as if they were some kind of impromptu jury. At 7, I would not have used the word strategy, but that is what it was. He refused to let this be a private search in the dark. He turned it into a demonstration. He walked to his car slowly, with his shoulders relaxed, so no one could reasonably accuse him of reaching for a weapon. His men followed but stopped a few paces back, forming a loose semicircle. I hovered between them, unsure if I should move closer or farther away. Curiosity tugged me forward. Fear argued for distance. He crouched beside the rear wheel well, the fabric of his pants stretching over his knee. And someone behind us stepped forward with a phone, the flashlight clicking on. The beam cut a white path under the car, turning dust motes into tiny stars. Everything went quiet again. For a second, there was nothing but the hum of the streetlights and the faint buzz of the phone's microphone as it recorded. Then the light hit the plastic. From where I stood, I could not see every detail, but I saw enough. 3 solid shapes wrapped tight in clear plastic, strapped to the undercarriage with professional-looking ties. On the plastic were strips of white and yellow tape printed with words I had seen on crime shows and, more recently, in the evidence locker at the back of the precinct when my class had visited on a field trip, property of the Savannah Police Department, evidence. There were numbers, too, the kind that get written on forms and logged into computers. Next to the bundles was a small rectangle of metal and plastic with a blinking red light. Even at 7, I knew what a tracker looked like. Delivery drivers had them on their dashboards. School buses had them to reassure nervous parents. This one did not belong here. A ripple moved through the crowd, starting as a hush and then turning into whispers. I heard someone say that those looked like real evidence bags. Someone else asked how they would have ended up under a civilian's car. Ethan stepped in quickly, talking about stolen narcotics, about sophisticated criminal setups, about desperate attempts to discredit the department. His words came faster now, the smoothness cracking just a little at the edges. He tried to shift the blame to faceless enemies we could not see. Dominic did not argue. That was the unnerving part. He simply stood up and stated the obvious, that the evidence bags had numbers. Those numbers meant records, that each bag, each item, had a story attached to it somewhere with dates and signatures and names of officers who had handled them. He did not have to say that the trail would lead back to Ethan. The implication hung in the air like humidity. He did not stop at his own car. He moved to the second one in line, gestured for the light again, and knelt. The same sight greeted us. More plastic-wrapped bricks, more strips of official tape, another tracker blinking stubbornly in the dark. By the time he reached the third car and then the fourth, the pattern was impossible to ignore. It was not one rogue stash under one vehicle that might have been explained away. It was an entire row of supposed criminals with identical evidence crawling across the bellies of their cars. I watched the faces around me shift in real time. At first, there had been that little spark of excitement people get when they think they are about to witness a big takedown, the kind you tell your coworkers about the next day. As each car revealed its hidden cargo, that spark dimmed. In its place came confusion, then anger. A woman from our neighborhood pushed to the front. I recognized her as the lady from the bookstore on the next street, the one who let me sit in the corner and read on days when my mom worked late. She raised her voice in a way I had never heard from her in the shop. She reminded everyone within earshot how the Moretti Foundation had quietly helped rebuild their little library after a flood nearly destroyed it, how no one from the city had answered their calls until the dust had settled. A man from the hardware store chimed in, talking about how Dominic's shipping company gave his son a job when no one else would hire a young ex-con. The pastor from the small church near the docks spoke about anonymous donations that kept their youth programs alive. None of them defended the Morettis as saints. That was not the feeling. It was more like they refused to stand by and watch a story they knew did not fit be forced onto the people who had shown up for them when the official channels did not. I watched the line of officers across from us. Many of them kept their faces blank, eyes fixed somewhere above the crowd. But one younger officer, barely out of his early 20s, had gone almost as pale as his shirt collar. His hand shook when he reached for his radio. I saw his lips form the words "internal affairs," and I saw the way Ethan stiffened in response, as someone had yanked on a cord tied to his spine. There was a sharp exchange between them, more body language than words. Ethan trying to pull rank, the younger man caught between training and conscience. I did not know the intricacies then, but I felt the crack widening. This was no longer United Blue against a mobster. This was something messier. The longer we stood there, the more phones were held high. People were no longer pretending to check texts. They were filming, documenting every movement, every expression, every angle on those evidence bags under those cars. For once, the power of being watched did not belong solely to the men with guns and badges. I remember standing very still, feeling the weight of Dominic's hand settle lightly on my shoulder at one point, steady and reassuring. No one told me to go inside. No one tried to hide me. I was, for better or worse, part of the picture now. When the sirens came, they were different from the earlier ones. Sharper, layered, approaching fast from more than one direction. 2 dark SUVs with federal plates rolled up, their blue lights painting the brick facades in pulsing color. Agents in plain suits stepped out with that distinct combination of boredom and alertness people wear when they know they outrank everyone else on the scene. They did not look at Dominic first. They looked at the evidence under the cars. They looked at the growing crowd of neighbors. They looked at the line of local officers and the detective at the center of it all. Even at 7, I understood that something had shifted. This was not going to be wrapped up with one arrest and a press conference. There were too many witnesses, too many cameras, too many numbered bags strapped where they should never have been. Years later, I would read the reports and understand just how far back the rot went. I would learn about the 5-year pattern of Ethan Cole using those same kinds of discoveries to put people away who did not fit his idea of a clean city. But that night, all I really knew was that the truth under those cars had dragged the story out of his hands and into the light. As the agents started pulling people aside for statements and taking photos from every angle, I sat on the curb for a moment, my legs finally too tired to hold me up. I watched them photograph Dominic's car like it was a crime scene, and Ethan like he might be too. I did not have the words for any of it yet, but I could feel the shape of a question settling over the whole block. If the man with the badge was the one planting the poison, what else in our city had we been getting backwards? If that night on the sidewalk felt like a storm, the hours that followed felt like the flood afterward. The FBI agents broke the scene down into pieces. Cars are taped off, evidence photographed from every angle, officers separated and questioned, neighbors, servers, and diners pulled aside one by one. Somewhere in that chaos, someone decided I counted as a witness too. They sat me on a hard bench inside the restaurant, away from the glass, under a light that buzzed faintly. One of the agents crouched down so we were almost eye level. He spoke slowly, as if the words needed to be gentle to make it past my fear. He asked what I had seen in the alley, how close I had been, and what the men looked like. He wanted to know about the packages, about the way Detective Ethan Cole had moved, about the things he had said. I remember my mom arriving in a blur, hair half out of its clip, apron still on. One of the neighbors had called her. She pulled me into her arms so tightly I could barely breathe, then held me against her side while I talked. Her fingers never left my shoulder. Every time I described something dangerous, she flinched a little, like the memory was a physical object flying toward us. That night did not end at midnight. It stretched into the small hours, into that strange time when even the city seems to sigh. When they finally let us go home, the sky over Savannah was starting to lighten. My mom tucked me into bed without talking about any of it, but I woke up to the sound of the news the next morning and saw Ethan's face on the screen, not as a hero this time, but as the subject of questions. The investigation took months. As a kid, those months were measured in school days and holidays, and the number of times my mom reminded me to be careful going anywhere alone. For the adults, it was measured in search warrants, interviews, and files dragged out of storage. From where I stood, it felt like watching a statue crack. The man whose photo had hung in the precinct lobby as an example of excellence suddenly had reporters waiting outside his driveway. The same news anchors who used to praise him began using words like alleged pattern and misconduct. The city, which had been so eager to believe in a clean, righteous crusade against crime, had to sit through nightly segments about stolen narcotics, missing evidence, and defendants whose cases suddenly did not look as solid as everyone had assumed. Later, when I was older, I would read summaries of what they found. 5 years of cases where evidence appeared in suspiciously similar ways. Drugs were taken from the property room and never logged properly. People with foreign last names, rough neighborhoods, or existing records were suddenly discovered with exactly the right amount of contraband to put them away for a very long time. Back then, all I knew for sure was that every few weeks my mom would come home with another scrap of gossip from customers at the flower shop, and more than once I watched her turn off the television when Ethan's name came up, as if protecting me from his face would protect me from the truth. Months after that night, we found ourselves walking up the wide steps of the federal courthouse. I wore my best dress, the one my mom saved for church and special occasions. The building felt too big for us, all marble and echo. It smelled like paper and old coffee and nerves. I remember sitting on a wooden bench outside the courtroom, my legs swinging, watching lawyers in dark suits stride past with folders tucked under their arms. Inside, the formalities of justice unfolded in a language I did not fully understand. The judge's voice was steady. Ethan sat at a table with his attorneys, looking smaller than he had on television, smaller than he had even on that sidewalk. There was no badge, no spotlight, just a man in a suit staring at the surface of the table like he might find another life there if he looked hard enough. When the sentence came, it was just a number to me. 15 years. I knew it had been a long time because of the way the courtroom shifted, the way people in the back exhaled all at once. 12 convictions tied to his work were already in the process of being overturned. More would follow. The adults spoke in terms of precedent and appeals. I thought about the people behind those case numbers. One of them was a man named Daniel Park. I did not know him personally, but his story made its way through the neighborhood as stories do. A young father picked up in a raid, accused of dealing, insisted the drugs were not his. No one wanted to hear it at the time. He disappeared into the system, leaving behind a mother who limped when she walked, and a pregnant wife who came into our shop once to ask about cheap flowers for a baby shower she never got to have. On the day of Ethan's sentencing, Daniel was brought into the same building through a different door. By then, the evidence that had put him away was discredited, his case reopened. I saw him in the hallway afterward, his mother clutching his arm as if she might never let go again. His toddler, a little boy with serious eyes, squirmed in his wife's arms until Daniel reached for him. The boy's hand closed in his father's shirt, and everything else in the corridor went quiet for a moment. I understood then, even at that age, that the decision I made in an alleyway had ripples far beyond one man and his shiny car. When we stepped outside onto the courthouse steps, the air felt different from the night of the raid. Brighter, cooler, but heavy in another way. There were cameras at the bottom of the steps, reporters calling out questions about corruption and reform, and what this meant for Savannah. My mom steered us to the side, away from the microphones. That was where Dominic found us. He did not come flanked by a crowd this time. Just one man, a few paces behind him, eyes scanning the street. Dominic kept his hands visible, away from his pockets, as if he understood that my mother measured safety in inches and gestures. He greeted her first, using her name. I felt her spine go rigid next to me. Gratitude and fear pulled at her face in opposite directions. This was the man whose cars I had saved from being rolling prisons. He was also the man she had warned me about since I was old enough to understand the difference between good trouble and bad trouble. He thanked her for allowing me to speak up that night. He said my courage had stopped an injustice and started something bigger than any of us could see from that sidewalk. He glanced toward the courthouse doors when he said it, as if to include Ethan's victims in the reach of that moment. Then he turned his attention to me. In his world, he told me, saving a life was not a small thing. It created a debt that did not vanish with time. Not the kind of debt you paid with cash, but the kind you carried in your bones. He said he took that seriously, that protecting the people who had protected him was not optional. He reached into his jacket then, and my mom's hand tightened around my wrist instinctively. What he pulled out was not a weapon, not an envelope of money, but something small that gleamed in the sunlight. A silver charm on a fine chain, shaped like a magnolia blossom. If you have never seen a magnolia up close, it is easy to mistake it for something fragile. The petals look like porcelain, smooth and pale, but the trees themselves are stubborn, their roots deep in southern soil. That little charm caught the light as he held it out, the petals etched with more care than I expected from a man like him. He looped it into my palm, closing my fingers around it. The metal was cool against my skin. He told me that magnolia was Savannah's flower, that it had a way of hanging on through storms. He wanted me to have a reminder that the city was mine too, no matter who tried to tell my family otherwise. He added something about a number, a card my mom could use if we ever needed help. My mom accepted the card like it was a live wire. At some point in that exchange, the question that had been sleeping in the back of my mind pushed its way out. I did not say it as an accusation, more as a confession of confusion. People called him a bad man. They whispered about the things his family did at the docks. They used words like mob and organized crime when they thought kids were not listening. He did not pretend to be innocent. He did not try to sell me a fairy tale. He said his world was complicated, that survival in it had never been clean. He said loyalty and family came first, that lines had been crossed over the years that he did not expect a child to understand. But he also said he loved Brooklyn Street and the people who lived along it. That was when the city looked away from certain neighborhoods. He did not. That sometimes the ones you are told to fear are the only ones who show up when it counts. I did not know what to do with that answer at 7. I still do not have a simple response now. What I know is this. I walked down those courthouse steps with a magnolia charm in my hand and a new weight in my chest. I had helped take down a man the city had trusted, and in doing so, I had tied my life, in ways I did not yet see, to another man the city would never fully trust. That tiny piece of silver became more than jewelry over the years. It became a reminder that one night in Savannah, I stepped out of the alley and changed the direction of 2 men's lives. One went to prison. One walked free with his empire intact. And somewhere between them stood a little girl with a flower-shaped charm and a debt of protection she never asked for but would carry into adulthood, all the way to the doorstep of the woman I eventually became. 17 years is a long time to carry one small piece of silver. By the time I turned 24, the magnolia charm Dominic gave me was no longer bright. The petals were a little scuffed, the edges dulled from catching on sweaters and aprons, and the inside of my palm when I was nervous. I wore it almost every day without thinking. It sat just below my collarbone as I unlocked the front door of Riverbend Florals in the half-light of early morning, the metal cool against my skin while the rest of the city was still warming up. Most days started the same way. I would roll up the metal gate, breathe in the faint leftover smell of yesterday's blooms, and hit the lights. The shop would blink awake. Rows of glass vases along the wall, buckets of flowers lined up like sleepy soldiers. The old wooden counter with its scratched surface and stubborn cash drawer. The cooler hummed in the corner, full of chilled roses and lilies and whatever else I could afford from the market that week. There was a comfort in the routine. Fill the buckets with fresh water until my fingers went numb. Strip leaves, Trim stems, drop flowers one by one until the colors begin to make sense, sweep leaves off the floor, set a small arrangement in the window so the first people walking their dogs would see something pretty. Sometimes I would catch my reflection in the glass out front. Dark hair pulled back in a messy knot, sleeves pushed up, hands already stained green at 8 in the morning. I looked like myself and like my mother at the same time. Same set to the shoulders, same little furrow between the eyebrows when I was focused. The only real difference was that the name on the sign above the door now read Riverbend Florals instead of Maria's Flowers. My mom still worked with me when she felt up to it. Her knees were not what they used to be, and some days the stairs up from our apartment above the shop took more out of her than arranging 10 centerpieces ever had. But she refused to stay home. She said the shop kept her young. I suspected the truth was that it kept her from thinking too much about everything we had almost lost. When a police cruiser rolled past the window, I still paused without meaning to. It was a tiny hitch in my movements, scissors hovering over a stem, hand frozen on the cash drawer. I wasn't afraid in the way I had been as a child, but I never fully shook the knowledge that uniforms and badges were not guarantees of anything. I had seen one of the city's finest led away in handcuffs because I opened my mouth at 7. That sort of thing rewires you. The neighborhood had changed since that night. Some of the old shops were gone, replaced by boutiques and coffee places with chalkboard menus. Rents had gone up faster than the paint could dry on the new facades. Our flower shop sat like a stubborn holdout among them, still here, still smelling like damp earth and eucalyptus. We should not have survived some of those years. On paper, we were a bad investment. Small, family-run, more heart than business plan. There were stretches where the numbers did not make sense. I would sit at the counter after closing with a stack of bills in one hand and a calculator in the other, trying to figure out how to make rent, electric, and fresh inventory coexist without some miracle. Sometimes the miracle slipped in quietly. A landlord's email extending a deadline. A utility notice that turned inexplicably into an apologetic system error. A supplier offering terms more generous than they had any reason to offer us. My mom called it luck. I called it suspicious. It wasn't one thing that tipped me off. It was 100 small inconsistencies that finally piled up high enough that I had to look at them. One slow afternoon, business dead between the lunch rush and the after-work crowd, I decided to get brave and dig through the old lease paperwork. The file cabinet in the back office was full of handwritten notes and crumpled envelopes, my mother's life stacked on metal rails. Somewhere between the original lease from when she took over the shop and the most recent renewal, I started noticing new names. Riverfront Properties LLC on one addendum. An adjustment signed off not by our landlord but by some representative from a holding company I had never heard of. Another letter that extended our lease at the current rate, in recognition of long-term tenancy, was sent from yet another corporate name that didn't match the man who came by to fix the heater. On a whim, I started writing them all down in a notebook. Riverfront Properties, Harborview Investments, Southern Oaks Management. I stared at the list for a long time. There was a pattern there, hiding just out of reach. It took a late-night internet search and a lot of squinting at public records, but eventually all those little company names branched back to a single trunk, a larger entity quietly sitting behind them like a shadow. Moretti Holdings. I remember sitting back hard in the creaky office chair, the magnolia charm suddenly heavy against my chest. Part of me wanted to laugh at myself. Of course, the man who had talked about life debts on courthouse steps would not consider his promise fulfilled just because he handed me a piece of jewelry and a phone number 17 years ago. He had been paying the bills I did not know I could not pay, nudging landlords, buying up properties on our block and then making sure our lease never rose past what we could scrape together, keeping the lights on in a way that let my mother believe it was providence and good old-fashioned hard work. I felt two things at once, so sharply they almost canceled each other out. On one side, embarrassment that my independence was, at least in part, an illusion. I had told myself I was keeping this place alive on grit and talent, that I was building something separate from what happened when I was 7. To realize that there had been a net under us the whole time, spun by a Mafia family's corporate arm, made me feel small and managed. On the other side was something closer to gratitude, and something even more dangerous than that. A sense of being seen. Dominic had a whole city to run, a whole empire to watch, and yet someone in his world had taken the time to make sure the tiny flower shop on Brooklyn Street never got pushed out by rising rents. I did not know if he checked in on those reports personally, or if it was just a line item on a spreadsheet somewhere. But either way, the message was the same. I had not fallen off his radar. The debt he believed existed between us was still, in his mind, very much open. I didn't tell my mom what I found. She slept better, thinking the distance between you, the Morettis, and US had grown with every passing year. I let her keep that comfort a little longer. I just started to pay more attention to the mail. The invitation came on an ordinary Tuesday. I was behind the counter, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, when the shop's old laptop chimed. New email. I almost ignored it. Then I saw the sender. The Moretti Foundation. My first reaction was physical. A tightening in my gut, a prickle at the back of my neck, as if some part of my nervous system recognized the name before my brain finished reading it. I clicked it open anyway. It wasn't written like a favor. That was the odd thing. It read like any other corporate inquiry. Polite, professional, full of details. They were hosting a charity gala at a waterfront restaurant in a few weeks, raising money for a youth arts program. They had seen my work around the neighborhood and heard good things about Riverbend Florals. They wanted to know if I was available to provide floral design and installation for the event. Budget attached. Timeline outlined. Links to prior galas, to give me an idea of the scope. It was, by any measure, the biggest job I had ever been offered. Enough money to stabilize the shop for months, maybe longer, if I planned well. Enough exposure that my little storefront might finally feel less precarious and more permanent. I stared at the screen, the words blurring a little at the edges. Part of me knew I should say no. Keeping our distance had been the unspoken agreement all these years. They protected us from the shadows, and we pretended not to notice. Stepping into a Moretti Foundation gala would mean trading anonymity for proximity, putting my face and my work back in the same room as the man whose world I had only ever approached as a child. Another part of me, the part that remembered empty order books and late notices, understood that sometimes survival looked like accepting help from places that complicated your conscience. I reached up without thinking and touched the magnolia charm, feeling the familiar curve of its petals against my fingers. 17 years ago, I had stepped out of the alley because my gut would not let me stay still. Now, that same gut twisted for a different reason. The cursor blinked in the reply box like a heartbeat, waiting. I knew before I even started typing that taking this job would change something I could not yet name. It would pull me out of the safe, flower-scented bubble I had built, and back into the orbit of a man who had every reason to see me as both his salvation and his vulnerability. I clicked on the attachment one more time, taking in the date, the venue, and the scale. Then I took a breath, steadying myself, and began to write, because somewhere between gratitude and resentment, between fear and curiosity, a new version of that old courage was waking up. The river always smells different depending on the time of day. That afternoon, it smelled like warm metal and salt and old wood baking in the sun. I parked a little farther down from the waterfront restaurant than I needed to, just so I could walk a few extra seconds and get my breathing under control. My portfolio bag knocked gently against my hip with each step, a quiet reminder that I was here as a professional, not as the kid who once shouted at a man to look under his car. Inside, the place was half-finished and echoing. Staff were unpacking glassware, stacking plates, and dragging tables across polished floors. Someone tested the sound system, and a low thump of bass pulsed through the empty space before cutting off. The big windows looked out over the Savannah River, where the water moved slowly and brown, carrying sunlight on its back. I checked in with the event coordinator, a woman in a sleek black dress and an efficient smile. She rattled off timing and head counts, pointing at areas where arrangements would go, where the step and repeat backdrop would stand, and where the donors' tables needed extra attention. I nodded, scribbling notes, mentally picturing vases and arches and hanging installations, instead of letting myself imagine what it would feel like to turn a corner and see Dominic. That was the quiet bargain I made with myself at the start of the walkthrough. Focus on flowers, not on him. I walked the perimeter of the main room, counting outlets and measuring distances with my eyes. The floor plan they had emailed me started to come alive in my head. Tall arrangements near the bar to hide the column I disliked. Low bowls of garden roses were placed along the center of each table so guests could see each other without ducking. A cascading piece on the welcome table that would draw the eye the second people stepped inside. It helped, having something to obsess over. It gave my hands something to do, my mind somewhere to go besides 17 years back in time. Still, he was there on the edges of my thoughts. Not the legend, not the stories, but the details my memory refused to let go of. The way his hand had felt steady on my shoulder on that sidewalk. The way his voice had gone softer when he talked about loyalty and gray areas on the courthouse steps. The tiny pause before he closed my fingers around the magnolia charm. I wondered what his hair looked like now, if the scar near his eyebrow had deepened. Suppose he had new lines around his mouth from smiling or from frowning. I wondered if he thought about that night as often as I did, or if I was just one chapter in a book he had long since closed. The answer walked in about 20 minutes into the walkthrough. I didn't see him at first. I heard the shift in the room before I found him. Conversations near the entrance dropped a notch. 2 staff members straightened their posture. Even without looking, my body knew. Goosebumps ran across my arms, ridiculous in the warm air. When I did turn, he was just inside the double doors, speaking quietly to the coordinator. Older, yes. More silver threaded through the dark hair, more depth to the lines around his eyes. But the center of him was the same. The way space made room. The way people's attention curved toward him, as if drawn by something they did not fully understand. He wore a dark suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone. Nothing flashy. Nothing that screamed power. It was the absence of effort that made it obvious. Men who try to look important announce themselves. Men who are important walk like this. For a second, I was 7 again, staring at him from across a room with my hands shaking. Then his attention slid past the coordinator and found me. A lot of things happened in that look. I saw recognition land and widen his gaze just a fraction. I saw calculation, the quick check for danger. He probably couldn't turn off if he tried. And under it all, I saw something that made my stomach flip in a way I didn't want to name. The way his eyes softened, just barely, like he was seeing something he had been expecting but not quite prepared for. I realized I'd been holding my breath. He crossed the distance between us at an unhurried pace, giving me time to decide whether to bolt. I stayed put, mostly because my feet refused to embarrass me in front of the event staff. When he reached me, he greeted me like someone he had seen more recently than 17 years ago. Like my face wasn't frozen at 7 in his memory but had been aging right alongside his. He mentioned the shop, the neighborhood, the fact that he had heard good things about my work. I listened to the rise and fall of his voice and tried to hear it like any other client, not like the soundtrack to my most formative trauma. He glanced once at the hollow of my throat where the magnolia charm rested. There was the slightest curve at the corner of his mouth when he saw it, and for reasons I did not want to examine, my skin warmed under the metal. He did not linger on the past, but it was there between us like another person. He talked about the gala, about the youth arts program they were raising money for, about wanting the room to feel a certain way. I responded with the vocabulary I knew best: color palettes, line of sight, and how flowers could make people feel without them realizing why. Underneath the logistics, there was a different conversation happening, one with no words. He was measuring the woman I had become against the girl he remembered. I was measuring the man in front of me against the myth and against the memory of his hand closing around a silver charm. It hit me then that he was not just older. He was tired in places he hadn't been before. The kind of tired that doesn't show up in posture but in the eyes of someone who has carried too many people on his back for too long. It made him look more human, which, perversely, made him more dangerous. We walked the room together while the coordinator talked through timelines. He listened, nodded, occasionally offered an opinion, but he let me do the creative thinking. I caught staff glancing at us when they thought we weren't looking, their expressions a mix of curiosity and a little fear. To them, I was the girl who had somehow earned the right to walk shoulder to shoulder with him, clipboard in hand. Eventually, the walkthrough moved toward practicalities, where guests would arrive, where the valets would take the cars, and how deliveries would come in. That part took us toward the back of the restaurant, through a service hallway that smelled like bleach and leftover onions, and out onto a covered loading area. The light changed there. It was harsher, fluorescent buzzing under the awning, the river air replaced by the scent of dumpsters and diesel. A few catering staff were smoking near the far wall, their conversation low and unremarkable. We checked access points, noted where I could safely stage flowers out of the sun. The coordinator's phone rang, and she excused herself to take the call. Dominic stepped away for a moment to speak with one of his men, a tall guy I recognized from the background of 100 neighborhood sightings. He always seemed to be around, always half a step behind Dominic in photos, nameless in the way dangerous people sometimes are. I drifted a little farther down the ramp, curious about the view of the parking lot. From there, I could see where the cars would line up, how close they'd be to the loading bay. I was thinking about how to get large arrangements in and out without blocking traffic, when voices carried around the corner. They weren't loud, but tension sharpened them enough for fragments to cut the air. 2 men, just out of sight. One voice I didn't recognize. The other, I thought I might, though I couldn't place where. They were not talking about table layouts. I caught my own name first. Not the whole thing. Just the way someone said, the florist, and the girl with the shop on Brooklyn. Then Dominic's name, laced with a kind of contempt people usually hide better. There was a comment about the gala being the perfect place because everyone would be distracted. A laugh that wasn't amused, more like it was impressed by the cruelty of its own idea. Then the phrase that made my stomach drop. His soft spot. His leverage. The one person he wouldn't be able to watch bleed without losing his mind. It took me a second to understand they were still talking about me. I felt my back press instinctively against the wall, like I could melt into the brick and disappear. My heartbeat roared in my ears, drowning out some of the words, but enough got through. They were not making immediate plans, not laying out blueprints. They were gauging, testing, considering what it would cost to go after the florist he owed. One of them sounded like he thought it would be a waste, like there were easier ways to hurt a man like Dominic. The other sounded almost eager. I didn't wait to hear more. Adrenaline shoved me back toward the door, toward the brighter, safer chaos of the main room. My face must have betrayed something because the coordinator frowned when she saw me, asking if everything was all right. I heard myself say something about needing to double-check measurements inside, my voice a shade too high. From across the room, Dominic glanced up from whatever conversation he was in. His eyes found mine, and for a moment, I had the wild thought that if I walked straight to him and told him what I'd heard, someone's life would end before dessert was served on gala night. I didn't move. Standing there in that polished event space, with servers polishing glassware and designers fussing over fabric swatches, I realized that accepting this job had done more than secure my shop's finances. It had put a target on my back with a neat little bow of eucalyptus and roses. I wasn't just the florist anymore. I was the woman someone had just named as the way to make Dominic Moretti kneel. And whether I liked it or not, there was no unhearing that. The drive back from the waterfront felt shorter than it should have. I remember gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly, replaying those voices in my head. The way they said "the girl with the shop in Brooklyn" made me feel like I was an object on a shelf. The amusement in that word, leverage. I drove past my own street twice before I was ready to pull in, like distance alone could make the threat less real. Inside the shop, everything looked exactly the same. That was the worst part. The bell over the door chimed like always. The buckets of flowers waited in their usual spots. My mom called down from upstairs to ask how the meeting went, her voice carrying that mix of hope and worry she always had when business might be good. I lied by omission. I told her the gala was a big job, that the venue was beautiful, that the foundation wanted a lot of white and green, clean and classic. I left out the part where two men had almost casually discussed whether killing me would be worth the trouble of watching Dominic fall apart. Maybe that was cowardice. Maybe it was protection. In the moment, it felt like the only way to function. The first strange thing happened 3 nights later. I was closing up alone. My mom had gone upstairs early with a headache, and I stayed late to finish a mock-up for one of the gala centerpieces. I did my usual lock-up routine. Lights off in the front, check the back door, set the alarm. I could do it half asleep by then. When I came down the next morning, the front door was locked, the alarm light still blinking as it should have. Nothing was broken. Nothing was missing. But one of the display buckets had been knocked over. Stems lay scattered across the floor, water soaking the rug. A single rose had been snapped clean in half and left on the counter. It could have been me, tired and clumsy the night before. That is what I told myself as I cleaned up. But my body did not believe it. My shoulders stayed tight all morning. I kept glancing at the door like I was waiting for something else to fall. The second strange thing didn't give me as much room for excuses. A week before the gala, I came home from the market just after 7 in the morning, arms straining from buckets and boxes. The apartment we shared above the shop should have smelled like coffee and my mom's oatmeal. Instead, it smelled like cold air and something faintly metallic. The door was closed but not latched. Inside, drawers were open. The couch cushions were moved. My bedroom closet door stood wide, clothes pushed aside. Nothing was taken. My jewelry box was still there, with cheap earrings and the few nice things my mom owned, untouched. The magnolia charm lay where I had left it on the nightstand, catching the light. Whoever had been there had not wanted my stuff. They had wanted my life spread out like a map. The police came and wrote a report because that is what you are supposed to do. They took pictures, dusted for prints, and asked if I had any enemies. I told them no, because the list of people who might want to hurt me belonged to someone else's world. I did not mention Dominic. I didn't trust that his name on their notepads would make anything better. The moment they left, I called him. I didn't even pretend I was calling the foundation. I used the number on the old card he had given my mom, the one she had never thrown away but never used. It rang once before someone answered. A voice I didn't recognize routing me to someone I did. I told him about the voices at the venue, about the rows on the counter, about the open drawers, and the untouched valuables. I expected him to be skeptical, to tell me I was overreacting. He didn't. He was quiet, which was worse. Quiet in that particular way that meant something inside him had gone dangerous. Things moved very fast after that. By the end of the day, my landlord had new locks installed on both the shop and the apartment. Not the kind you buy at a hardware store. Heavy, solid, the sort that clicks with authority. A security company showed up with cameras and a new alarm system, wiring our little building like it was a bank. A dark sedan I had never seen before started waiting for me outside the shop in the mornings. The driver introduced himself as someone assigned to make sure I got where I needed to go. He said it like it was final, like this wasn't a negotiation. Luca arrived with him. I recognized him from the gala walkthrough, from a dozen glimpses over the years. He was the kind of man you notice without knowing why. Dark hair, easy smile, the build of someone who took his job seriously without needing to prove it in every room. Dominic trusted him. You could see it in the way people listened when he spoke, in the way he moved a half step ahead of Dominic without making it a performance. Now he was in my shop every day. He stood near the door when I opened, scanning the street before letting customers in. He checked the back alley before I took out the trash, walking the length of it with his hands in his pockets, eyes restless. He insisted on driving me to the venue and back for every gala delivery, waiting at the curb until he saw me step through the door of the apartment at night. On the surface, he was kind. He asked about my mom's health, about business, and about how I'd gotten into floral design. He praised my arrangements in a way that felt genuine, not like flattery. Sometimes he carried boxes without being asked, stacking them with an efficiency I appreciated. Underneath, there was something else. He noticed everything. What time do I usually lock up? Which routes did I take to the market? When I switched my schedule because a supplier was late, I started to realize that if someone ever needed a complete report on my movements, he would be able to recite it without checking a calendar. I should have felt nothing but grateful. The break-in had shaken my mother badly. She flinched at every creak in the floorboards that week. Knowing there was a car out front and a man downstairs with a direct line to Dominic did let her sleep a little easier. I couldn't ignore that. But there were nights when I lay in bed, the glow of the security panel seeping under my door, and felt like a butterfly pinned in a glass case. Safe, technically, but only because someone had decided my wings were worth keeping. Dominic came by the shop twice in those days, unannounced. He would appear in the doorway and tilt his head toward the back, and I'd know he wanted a few minutes without customers listening. He never raised his voice about the threats, but the anger bleeding through his control was its own kind of volume. He talked about tightening things up, about enemies who did not respect old lines, about how making me a target crossed a boundary even his world should understand. He said he owed me his life, and that he would not watch mine be taken as payment for someone else's ambition. He did not say that he cared about me beyond the debt, but it was there, in the way his gaze swept the shop like he was cataloging every exit, in the way his shoulders only eased when I assured him my mother was upstairs, behind new locks and monitored alarms, in the way his eyes softened for a heartbeat when they landed on the magnolia charm. I hated how much safer I felt when he was in the room. I also hated that safety had become something he could turn on and off with a phone call. As the gala drew closer, the incidents shifted. No more break-ins, no more overturned buckets. Instead, there were near misses that felt like someone testing the perimeter. One morning, Luca suggested a different route to the venue, citing construction on our usual street. We took it, and a few blocks from the restaurant, I saw a car I recognized from the neighborhood parked at an odd angle, its driver staring a little too intently as we passed. 2 days later, an anonymous text popped up on my phone with nothing but the time I had left the shop and the street I had walked down, like someone was letting me know they could see me even when Luca was not around. I mentioned all of this to Dominic, and each time he told me he was handling it. Each time, another layer of security wrapped tighter around my life. Somewhere in the middle of all of that, my instincts started whispering something I did not want to hear. It was small at first. A comment Luca made about a delivery time that he shouldn't have known. The way he stepped outside to take certain calls, eyes sliding away from mine. The fact that the suspicious car had shown up on the one morning he'd pressed me to change our routine. None of it was proof. It was just a pattern, the kind you only notice when your survival has depended on reading patterns since you were 7. I found myself watching him the way he watched the street, tracking his habits, cataloging the little inconsistencies, and I realized with a cold, unwelcome certainty that if danger had found its way this close to me, it might not only be pressing from the outside, it might be sitting in the driver's seat, hand resting casually on the gear shift, telling me he was here to keep me safe. Gala nights always look effortless from the outside. People see the candles and the music and the way the light hits the glasses just right and think it all floated into place like that. They do not see the sweat, the frayed tempers, the florist in flats running on caffeine and adrenaline. By the time the first guests started arriving at the waterfront restaurant, my hands smelled like eucalyptus and rose thorns and whatever industrial cleaner the staff had used on the floor. The room was exactly the way I had pictured it on that first walkthrough. Tall arrangements anchoring the corners, low bowls of white garden roses and ranunculus along each table, trailing vines softening the edges of linen and glass. The air felt cool and expensive, layered with flowers and perfume and the faint metallic taste of nerves. I moved through the space with a kind of clipped focus. Straighten a stem here. Nudge a votive an inch to the left there. Check that the arch at the entrance held its shape, that the blooms hadn't wilted under the lights. If I kept my mind on angles and colors, I didn't have to think about bombs or leverage, or the fact that someone out there had said my death would be a satisfying way to watch a man burn. Security was impossible to ignore, even if you didn't know what I knew. There were more dark suits than usual at the entrance, eyes scanning the crowd instead of the decor. Cars stopped at the curb and were checked with a thoroughness that would have felt paranoid if I hadn't already had my apartment turned inside out. Guests stepped out in gowns and tuxes, smiling, unaware of the invisible grid snapping into place around them. Luca hovered at the edge of my vision like a misplaced shadow. When I was at the welcome table, he was near the door. When I ducked behind the bar to fix an arrangement, he shifted to cover that angle. He never touched me, never raised his voice, but his presence was a low hum against my skin, constant and impossible to tune out. Every few minutes, I felt another gaze on me from a different direction. Dominic's. He was doing what he did best, moving through the crowd as it belonged to him, offering his hand, his smile, his attention, to anyone else. He looked relaxed, perfectly in his element, the benevolent patriarch of a charitable foundation. To me, the tiny shifts gave him away, the way his shoulders tightened barely when I crossed the room, the way his eyes did a quick sweep for me whenever he finished a conversation. At one point, I was adjusting candles on a side table when I felt that prickle between my shoulder blades that meant he was watching. I glanced up and found him across the room, mid-conversation with a city councilman, his face arranged in polite interest while his eyes said something entirely different. They said he was counting the distance between us. They said he had not forgotten the last time a public event had turned into a crime scene because of what someone had hidden under his car. I touched the magnolia charm at my throat without thinking, felt the familiar shape press into my fingertips, and told myself to breathe. The night moved in waves, speeches, applause, the clink of silverware as dinner was served. Between courses, I slipped in and out of the dining room to adjust arrangements and make sure nothing had been knocked over. Luca trailed at what he probably thought was a respectful distance, close enough to intervene if anyone got too close, far enough that I could pretend I was alone if I didn't look directly at him. The first time I stepped outside for air, it was purely instinct. The music had swelled, the room buzzing with 100 conversations layered on top of each other, and my chest suddenly felt too tight. I slipped toward the side doors, telling myself I needed to check the outdoor installation anyway. Big urns overflowing with white hydrangeas lined the terrace rail, framing a view of the river that guests would use for photos. It was an easy excuse. The night air met me like a cool hand on a fevered forehead. The river smelled different from the way it had the day of the walkthrough, less metal, more damp stone and exhaust from the line of idling cars at the entrance. The terrace lights cast soft pools on the brick, and beyond them, the parking area glowed under harsher bulbs. From where I stood, I could see the row of vehicles waiting at the curb. Some belonged to guests, some to security. One in particular drew my eye without my permission. A sleek black sedan parked closer to the entrance than the others, the driver standing just off to the side, posture too alert to be anything but one of Dominic's. I shouldn't have been able to tell which car was his. That was the whole point of security. But patterns have a way of announcing themselves if you've trained your brain to look for them since childhood. I told myself to go back inside, to check the flowers, to stop chasing ghosts under the chassis, and move on with my life. Then a valet jogged past with a flashlight, beam bouncing across bumpers and chrome. For half a second, the light skimmed under the black sedan, caught on something, and my stomach dropped through the floor. It wasn't even a clear image, just a glint where there shouldn't have been one, a shape breaking the smooth line of the undercarriage. Metal against metal, wrong in a way my body recognized before my mind caught up. Suddenly I was 7 again, in a different part of the city, staring at a different car and the plastic-wrapped bundles someone had slid into the shadows. I heard Ethan Cole's voice in my head, talking about cancer in the city. I remembered the taste of fear when I pushed open the restaurant door and interrupted a man's dinner because my gut screamed louder than my learned obedience. I blinked hard, tried to force the present back into focus. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was a reflection, a piece of road debris, some harmless part jutting out at a weird angle. Trauma can make you see threats in every scrap of trash on the pavement. I knew that. Every therapist in the world would have agreed. But the part of me that lived in the small, still space between fight and flight knew better. This was different. This was intentional. Someone who understood the symbolism of hiding death under his car had decided to repeat the lesson with a new teacher. The river noise faded. The music from inside became a distant thrum. All I could hear was my heart and my own breathing, and the echo of a child's decision reverberating across 17 years. I stepped off the terrace before I fully decided to. Luca's voice came from somewhere behind me, sharp with my name, but my legs were already moving. The valet with the flashlight glanced over, confused, as I approached the car, but I waved him closer without thinking, pointing at the patch of darkness under the chassis. I didn't crawl under the car myself. I wasn't that reckless. But I crouched enough to see more clearly as the beam cut through the shadow. There it was. Not plastic bags this time, but compact metal and wires nestled where they had no business being, affixed with a cruel kind of precision. There was no mistaking what it was meant to do. All the breath left my lungs at once. For a second, the world narrowed to a single thought. If he walked out here casually at the end of the night, if he slid into that back seat with the easy familiarity of a man who trusts his driver, he would die. I straightened so fast my head spun. I could have run back inside and whispered to someone else, let security handle it. I could have pulled Luca aside, told him what I'd seen, and kept Dominic insulated from the panic. Those would have been reasonable choices. Instead, my body chose the path it had once before. I went looking for him. Interrupting a man like Dominic in the middle of his own gala is not something people do. He was on stage when I shoved my way back into the main room, listening to a young artist talk about how the foundation had changed his life. Cameras were pointed at the podium. Donors watched from their tables, faces softening with the glow of charitable self-satisfaction. My timing could not have been worse. Or maybe it was perfect. I stayed near the back at first, heart pounding, telling myself to wait until the speech ended, to pull him aside quietly. Every second stretched like gum. I pictured someone pressing a remote, a circuit closing, the car outside becoming a fireball that would turn this entire evening into a horror story. The speech ended. Applause rose and fell. Dominic stepped closer to the young man, said something I couldn't hear, then turned away from the microphone. That was my window, and I took it. I moved forward, weaving between tables, ignoring the way chairs scraped as people shifted to see why the florist was breaking the invisible barrier between staff and stage. Dominic saw me coming. His expression shifted from professional warmth to something sharper, more concerned. I knew, in that instant, that he understood this was not about a floral emergency. I will not repeat what I said to him, because the exact words don't matter. What matters is the look on his face when he realized what I was really telling him. That there was something under his car again, that I had seen it, that I needed him to trust me one more time. The room did not hear my words, but it felt the temperature change. Security moved in an instant, men in suits appearing at the edges of the stage, listening intently, then fanning out toward the exits. One of them touched his earpiece, murmured into a mic, and the quiet evacuation began, disguised as a graceful transition to another part of the evening. Outside, the parking area transformed from orderly to urgent. Someone with a flashlight crawled under the car while another man held his breath beside him. Guests were steered indoors, away from windows, under the pretense of a surprise performance. Staff clustered by the kitchen doors, whispering. The driver stood off to the side, his face drained of color. I stayed a few steps behind Dominic, close enough to see the tension in his shoulders, far enough that I wouldn't be in the immediate blast radius if instinct had gotten it wrong this time. When the man under the car cursed softly and scrambled back, everyone who mattered understood at once. Bomb, device. Improv is something with enough force to turn steel into shrapnel. They didn't say the words out loud in front of me, but I saw them in their eyes. What followed was a blur of police, bomb squad, and specialized jargon. They cleared a radius. They worked their careful magic. They took the car away in pieces. I watched from the terrace, fingers digging into the railing until my knuckles went white, the river moving steadily below as if nothing in the universe had shifted. At some point, Dominic turned to look at me. All of the masks were gone in that moment. No host, no patron, no composed head of an empire. Just a man whose life had been aimed at by someone who knew where to place the crosshairs. His gaze swept my face like he was checking for burns that hadn't happened. Injuries I didn't have. Then something raw flickered through his eyes, gratitude edged with a fear so sharp it bordered on anger. He knew. He knew I had saved him again. And standing there in the echo of sirens, I let another realization settle over me like cold rain. This was not a coincidence, not a repetition of some old pattern for dramatic effect. Someone had chosen that method, knowing what it would do to both of us. Someone inside his world had given access, shared roots, and trusted someone with the kind of proximity you only give family. When I thought about who had been closest to that car, to our movements, to the quiet back doors and alternate routes, one name rose to the top like oil on water. Luca. The thought made my chest physically ache. I did not say it out loud that night. I had no proof, just a sick constellation of details lining up into a shape I didn't want to recognize. But as the bomb squad loaded twisted metal into evidence containers, and the gala limped on inside under forced smiles, I understood one thing with terrible clarity. Once again, my gut had dragged Dominic back from the edge of a grave dug under his car. And this time, the danger wasn't just wearing a badge or hiding in an alley. It was sitting at his table, driving his car, and walking me to my door. And whatever this connection was between us, this pattern of me pulling him away from death and becoming more of a target each time wasn't an old story closing. It was just getting started. The night did not end at the restaurant. One moment, I was on the terrace, watching the bomb squad work under a halo of flashing lights. The next, I was being guided toward a side exit with a firm hand at my elbow and the kind of calm urgency that tells you arguing is pointless. Someone said it was safer if I left before the press realized who I was. Someone else assured me my mother was already being taken to a secure location. It all blurred together. SUV doors opening, the heavy thunk of them closing, the smell of leather and cologne and fear inside the car. I sat between two of Dominic's men, the magnolia charm pressed into my palm so hard it left an imprint. No one spoke much. There was nothing left to say that the bomb hadn't already screamed for us. The drive out of the city felt longer than it probably was. Streetlights gave way to darker stretches of road, then to the quiet outlines of trees and big houses set back from the street. When we finally turned up a long, winding driveway, I saw the shape of a house emerge from the dark. Not ostentatious, not some gaudy mansion, but solid and old, set behind a gate that hummed faintly with electricity. Inside, the air felt different from Dominic's public spaces. The restaurant smelled like garlic and wine and polished wood. This place smelled like clean linen, coffee, and something sharper underneath gun oil. Maybe. And old paper. They took me through a side entrance and into a room that could have been any nice living room if you didn't look too closely. There was a couch, a few chairs, and shelves with books, but there were also details that did not belong in an ordinary home. A small table pushed against one wall, laid out with neatly arranged phones and encrypted radios. A locked cabinet that did not look like it held wine. A framed family photo sits beside a stack of folders with names and dates tabbed in red. Men moved in and out of the room with a purpose that made my skin prickle. Some I recognized from the gala, others from 100 glimpses in the neighborhood. They spoke in low tones, handing Dominic phones, papers, pieces of information that seemed to slot into some internal map he was updating by the second. I had never seen him like that before. This was not the man charming donors or the man chatting with my mom about roses. This was the boss. He listened more than he talked. When he did speak, the room shifted around his words. Men went still, then moved quickly. I caught phrases about routes, about access points, about who had known which car he would use that night. Luca's name floated through the air more than once. Someone brought me tea I didn't drink. Someone else told me my mother was upstairs, with a nurse checking her blood pressure because the bomb had scared 10 years off her life. I wanted to run to her, but Dominic said it was safer if movement stayed limited until they knew exactly what they were dealing with. He didn't have to raise his voice. The authority was in the fact that no one contradicted him. Hours bled together. My body hummed with leftover adrenaline. That wired, exhausted state where you feel like you could sleep for a week, and also as if you might never close your eyes again. I watched maps appear on the coffee table. City blocks sketched out with circles and arrows. I watched security footage on a laptop, a grainy image of the parking area from earlier in the day, a figure moving where they should not have moved. A car door that should not have opened. The first time I heard that Luca was missing, it was almost a side note. One of the men mentioned that he had not answered his phone since the bomb was found, that his car was gone from where it should have been parked. The second time his name came up, there was less confusion and more certainty. Leaks, patterns, calls traced back to numbers tied to a rival family Dominic had kept in check for years. No one said the word traitor out loud. They didn't have to. I didn't see what happened to him. Dominic did not invite me into that part of his night. All I know is that somewhere between midnight and dawn, the energy in the house shifted. The frantic edge eased, replaced by a cold, grim satisfaction. Orders changed from find him to clean this up. Someone carried a jacket down the hallway, which I recognized as Luca's. It was folded too carefully to be a casual gesture. That was how I learned what Dominic's justice really looked like, not from seeing blood, but from understanding that a man who had been at my side every day for weeks had vanished as completely as if the earth had opened and swallowed him. One of Dominic's people said quietly that I did not have to be afraid of Luca anymore. I wasn't sure that was the same thing as being safe. The horror and relief tangled together inside me. Luca had set me up, fed information to someone who wanted Dominic dead, and was willing to use me as bait. On some level, I was glad he would never stand near my mother's front door again, pretending to be a shield. On another level, I understood that what had been done to stop him was not something you could explain to a judge or put in a report. It was a different kind of law. Sometime near dawn, when the house had gone strangely quiet, and the men had mostly dispersed to other places, I found Dominic alone in what passed for his office. The room was smaller than I expected. A desk, a couple of chairs, a lamp casting soft light over stacks of paper. A large window looked out over the dark yard, the glass reflecting his silhouette. He had taken off his jacket and loosened his tie. The top buttons of his shirt were undone. For the first time since the bomb, he looked less like a general and more like a man who had not slept. His hands were braced on the back of a chair. From the doorway, I could see the slight tremor in his fingers. It was gone by the time he straightened and turned toward me. But I had seen it. And once you see something like that, you cannot unsee it. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was as all right as someone could be after watching a bomb get pulled from under a car with her client's name on it. I told him my mother had finally fallen asleep upstairs, exhaustion overriding fear. I did not tell him about the way my legs still shook if I stood up too fast. He said, in his own controlled way, that if I had not seen what I saw, he would be dead, that the car had been checked. Those protocols had been followed, that Luca had personally assured him everything was secure. He admitted, with a kind of bitter resignation, that trust had become a liability he could no longer afford, except in very limited places. When he talked about limited places, his eyes went to me. I felt something in my chest twist painfully. It hit me then that in his mental map of the world, I had moved from debt to anchor, not just a girl he owed his life to, but a person whose existence now affected which roads he took, which car he got into, which enemies dared to act. The idea that someone like him would let his decisions bend around someone like me was both terrifying and strangely intoxicating. I told him, quietly, that what he had done to Luca scared me, not because I thought Luca deserved mercy after what he'd done, but because it was a reminder that Dominic's world did not have a soft landing for people who crossed certain lines. I said that being near him meant living in a place where disappearing a man was sometimes the only answer. He did not argue. He did not apologize. He said that his world had always been like this, that the only difference now was that I had been brought inside enough to see it. He admitted that he had tried, for years, to keep my mother and me at a distance for exactly this reason. Anonymous lease extensions, quiet protection, help that looked like luck. Then he said something that took the ground out from under me in a different way. He said that when he saw me run toward him on that stage, when he understood what I was telling him about the car, there was a moment where he realized that if he lost me because of his enemies, he would become someone even he did not recognize. I did not know what to do with that. I had spent years telling myself I was just a story to him, a symbol of the one good thing he had managed not to ruin. Hearing that my life had become a point of no return for a man like Dominic was like being handed a weapon and a vow at the same time. It made me feel powerful and horribly vulnerable in the same breath. Standing in that office, watching him in the early light, I finally let myself admit the thing I had been dancing around since the moment I walked into his restaurant at 7. I cared about him, not in some clean, uncomplicated way you could fit into a greeting card. I cared about the man who sent workers to fix my mother's windows when no one else would. The man who listened to a little girl's warning without laughing. The man who made sure our shop survived when the city would have happily gentrified us into memory. The man who ordered terrible things done in my name so I could sleep at night. I cared about all of that together. The light and the dark. The contradictions that made him who he was. And because I cared, the reality of his world cut deeper. The maps and guns and vanished traders were no longer background noise from someone else's life. They were the price of proximity, the cost of standing too close to a man whose name could make people disappear and keep neighborhoods safe at the same time. As I left his office, the sky outside his window was shifting from black to gray. The house was quiet. My mother sleeping upstairs, Dominic alone with his decisions. I walked down the hallway with the magnolia charm warm against my skin, and a new, unwelcome clarity settling in my bones. I had seen his world clearly now, the generosity and the blood, the protection and the threats. I could no longer pretend I was just a florist who got caught in something by accident. I was his weakness and, in some twisted way, one of his strengths. The question that waited for me on the other side of that night was simple and impossible at the same time. Now that I knew exactly who he was, what did it say about me that I still wanted to stay within reach of his shadow? The shop always smells strongest in the morning. A mix of damp stems, soil, coffee, and whatever new blooms came in from the market that day. For a long time after the gala, that smell was the only thing that convinced me life was still mine. I would unlock the door at 7:30, flip the sign, and let the scent wrap around me like a reminder. This is who you are, not a pawn, not leverage. Just a woman who knows how to make something beautiful out of things that are always dying. On the surface, things went back to normal. Customers still came in asking for birthday bouquets and apology flowers, and something that looks like I put thought into it. The bell over the door still chimed. My mom still kept a stash of cookies behind the counter for kids who had to wait while their parents chose arrangements. But there was a line inside me now that wasn't there before. I could feel it when a car idled too long outside or when an unfamiliar face lingered in front of the window. I could feel it when my mom asked how that world was going to stay away from us now and then stopped herself because I wasn't 7 anymore, and this wasn't a conversation she could control with rules. She tried anyway, in her own way. She hovered for days after we came home from Dominic's safe house, following me from room to room like she was afraid I'd vanish if she let me out of her sight. When she thought I wasn't looking, she would touch the new locks, the security panel, the camera by the back door, like she was testing the strength of a fence around a yard where her child still played. We never sat down and dissected what happened to Luca, or what it meant that men like Dominic solved betrayal in ways you didn't report to the city. But one evening, when we were closing up, she stood in the middle of the shop and just looked at me for a long time. There was sadness there, and pride, and something like surrender. Not to him, to the fact that my life was no longer something she could steer with warnings about bad men and staying away from certain streets. I had walked straight into the center of all of that and walked out again. Blood on no one's hands and also on everyone's. She didn't say it, but I could hear it in the way she exhaled. You're going to make your own choices now. And all I can do is hope you remember who you are while you're loving whoever you love. For a while, I pretended I didn't know what choice I was avoiding. It would have been simple, on paper, cut Dominic out completely, change my number, refuse any more contracts from his foundation. Pretend that the man whose life I had dragged back from the brink twice was just some client whose checks cleared. Or go the other way. Move into his world fully. Live behind gates and guards. Let him fold my life into his in the name of protection, and call it love. The truth I didn't want to say out loud was that neither of those fit. I couldn't erase him. Too many pieces of my life had his fingerprints on them. The shop itself, our apartment, the way half the neighborhood had quietly benefited from his idea of responsibility. I also couldn't pretend that slipping into his world like a new suit would fix anything. Even inside his walls, bombs were still planted under cars. Even with all his power, he couldn't make danger disappear. He could only redirect it. So I started thinking about a middle path. What it would look like to keep my hands in water and dirt and petals while his were on ledgers and decisions and, sometimes, consequences I would never fully want to see. What kind of boundaries would I need in place if I didn't want to wake up one day and realize I'd become another one of his soldiers, someone who couldn't tell where his instincts ended and mine began. When I finally asked him to meet me, I chose neutral ground. Not his office, not the safe house, not some dim restaurant where you feel watched even when you're alone. Just the shop. After closing, buckets half empty, floor damp from mopping, the cooler humming in the back. My mom went upstairs early, giving us space without making it obvious that's what she was doing. He arrived without an entourage, which was its own kind of statement. One car is parked across the street. One man behind the wheel. Dominic in a dark coat, no tie. Lines at his eyes deeper than they'd been the night of the gala. Seeing him there, under the same flickering street lamp that had watched me grow up, did something strange to my heartbeat. It sped up and calmed down at the same time. We didn't have some Hollywood confession. No dramatic declarations, no ultimatums shouted over violins. We just stood among the flowers I'd been working on all day, peonies, eucalyptus, little sprays of waxflower, and talked like two people who had finally run out of room to pretend their lives weren't tangled. He said he could move my mom and me out of the city, somewhere quiet, somewhere safe. He laid it out like a plan. Better alarms, better walls, people he trusted with their lives. He told me he did not want to live in a world where he had to worry every time I walked down Brooklyn Street alone. Part of me wanted to say yes just for the relief in his eyes when he imagined that version of our future. But I told him the truth instead. I told him I loved this shop. That these streets and these customers and the kids who grew up watching me tie bows around their mother's birthday bouquets were as much a part of me as the scar on my knee from falling off my bike at 8. I told him I could not move into a fortress and pretend that made us safe, when we both knew danger had a talent for jumping walls. I told him that if I was going to stay in his life at all, it had to be as myself, not as an ornament. He kept it under glass. Not as a liability. He resented when things got hard. As the woman who would still open her door at 8 in the morning, still sweep her own floors, still flinch a little when a squad car rolled by, but refused to let that flinch own her. I told him I needed honesty about danger, not sugarcoating. That I needed him to promise my mom and the shop were off limits in any moves he made. That if his world came knocking on my door again, it would be because he was warning me, not because someone wanted to use me as a chess piece. He listened. That's the part that got me more than anything. He didn't argue that he knew better or try to bully me into the version of safety that made sense to him. He admitted that respecting those boundaries would go against every instinct he had as a man who solves problems by pulling them closer and locking them down. He said he would try anyway because the alternative was losing me, and that was a cost he wasn't willing to pay. When he stepped closer, it wasn't with the careless confidence of someone who assumes permission. It was careful, almost hesitant, his hand lifted, fingertips brushing the magnolia charm where it rested against my collarbone. The gesture pulled us back through nearly 2 decades, in an instant back to courthouse steps, and a little girl with shaking hands, and a man who had no idea she'd become the one person who could reroute his entire life. He didn't have to say the word love. It was in the way his shoulders dropped when I didn't pull away, in the way his thumb lingered against that tiny silver flower like it were a pulse point. Somewhere in the middle of that quiet, I realized I wasn't choosing between loving him and loving myself. I was choosing how to love him without losing myself. So that's where we left it. He went back to his world of maps and decisions and lines drawn in shadows. I stayed in mine of stems and soil and sunlight on the shop floor. The difference now is that the line between us isn't built on denial. It's built on choices, his to respect my boundaries, mine to walk beside his darkness with my eyes open instead of squeezed shut. We see each other more openly now. Coffee in the shop before it opens. Walks along the river on Sunday mornings when the city is still waking up. Sometimes there are weeks where the only sign of his presence is a quiet envelope covering a supplier bill I'd been losing sleep over. Sometimes he shows up in the doorway looking tired in that way you don't fix with sleep, and I just hand him a flower to hold while we talk about nothing for a few minutes. Is it simple? No. I live with the knowledge that being loved by a man like Dominic Moretti will probably never be clean. There will always be risk stitched into the seams. But I also live with the knowledge that courage isn't just about dragging someone away from a car with a bomb under it. Sometimes courage is staying. Sometimes it's saying no to the version of protection that locks you in a cage. Sometimes it's loving someone flawed and dangerous without lying to yourself about what that means. Sometimes it's looking at your own fear and still choosing to keep your eyes open. If you've listened this far, maybe there's some part of my story that feels familiar to you. Maybe you've had to decide whether to speak up when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Maybe you've loved someone whose world didn't fit neatly with your idea of who you were supposed to be. Maybe you've had to draw a line in the sand and say, I care about you, but I won't disappear for you. If this stirred something in you, I'd love to hear it. Tell me in the comments about a time you trusted your gut, or a boundary you had to set with someone you cared about. If my story made you think about courage, love, and where you draw the line, tap like, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe so we can keep having these hard, honest conversations together. The magnolia charm still glints at my throat when I lock up the shop at night. Sometimes, when I look across the street and see a familiar dark car waiting under the street lamp, I touch it and smile to myself. I'm still just a woman with a flower shop. I'm also the woman a mafia boss cannot afford to lose. And I'm learning, one brave choice at a time, how to live with both of those truths at once.